Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1055th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the huge pleasure and privilege and joy of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Stephanie Syjuco and Tausif Noor. And now I'll introduce our guest and host for today. Stephanie Syjuco works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing and archive excavations. Recently, she's focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of racialized, exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Born in the Philippines, she is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and has exhibited at many institutions. She is an associate professor at UC Berkeley. And our host today, Tausif Noor, is a critic, curator, and PhD student in modern art history at UC Berkeley. His criticism and essays have appeared in Artforum, the New York Times, The New Yorker, and other publications, as well as in various artist catalogs and monographs. He is a recipient of a 2023 Grace Dudley Prize for Arts Writing from the Robert B. Silvers Foundation, as well as a 2023 Andy Warhol Foundation Creative Capital Arts Writers Grant for short form writing. Tausif and Stephanie, it's such a joy to have you on the NSE, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to you, Tausif, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Thank you, Eleanor, everyone at the Brooklyn Rail. It's such a pleasure to be in this conversation today with Stephanie. Thanks have to just go out to you so much for your generosity in engaging with us, your generosity with how you engage with your own practice and your pedagogy. And I think that, to me, those two things can't be separated. I learned so much from your work. I learned so much from your students. I know your students learn so much from you, but I also think that what's so incredible about the way you work across these different forms and mediums is that you are putting so much pressure on what it means to know, what it means to know from history, what it means to know from form itself. And I think that the way that you're exploring form, and the way that you're sort of putting pressure on us as viewers to really consider how much is embedded in what we see and what we experience, and how we can unlock those forms of knowledge by looking more carefully, by asking deeper questions. And to that end, I'd like to just say that your work right now holds so much importance for me as we think about the politics of the image, as we are sort of witnessing, not sort of witnessing, as we are witnessing through screens, the genocide that's ongoing in Gaza. And I think that if we were all to take a more critical eye as you do and really think about what it means to think about an image, what it means to construct an image, and how those images circulate and inform the reality in which we live, I think we would be in a much better world. And I just have to say that the questions you're asking about what it means to be visible and what visibility means in our world are questions that all artists should be asking and that viewers should always be asking ourselves. So I'm so thrilled to continue our conversations and to share this with the Brooklyn Rail audience. And maybe we can start with one of the slides. Our viewers in New York who have had the pleasure of seeing the exhibition Going Dark at the Guggenheim, curated by Dr. Ashley James, will be familiar with this image, which is called Total Transparency Filter. And I'm wondering if you could do us the honors of describing a little bit of the process and the sort of conceptual grounding of this image, which is, it's just haunting. It's a very haunting image, and I wonder if we could maybe unpack it a little bit together.
Yeah, well, Tausif, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And also, thanks for hosting this talk, Brooklyn Rail. I think we're going to cover a number of images, dealing with issues of visibility or, a kind of forced invisibility that some of us have to undergo. And the one of the earliest works we're going to look at is this particular one. So Total Transparency Filter is a portrait, but it's a portrait in the sense that it's also one that hides as much as it attempts to be present. So this was included, as Tausif was saying, in the recent exhibition Going Dark at the Guggenheim. And I really saw it as a touchstone for a kind of contemporary examination of how there's sometimes a difficulty in being visible, specifically for political or social reasons. In this particular case, the person who's being covered in this sheer fabric, which is in a pattern of a Photoshop kind of background layer. For those of you familiar with digital imaging processes, there are everything from chroma key green, which is meant to kind of drop out color or drop out, the color to be substituted by any other background image, or in this case, this gray and white checkerboard pattern, which is a digital kind of pattern meant to also be not seen. So when I photographed this individual, it was during 2017, during the post-Trump presidential election. And this particular person is undocumented at the time. So what was happening was, a big kind of scramble to figure out how to create safety nets for people who at one time had been potentially promised entry into the country through DACA. And it was a huge time of upheaval, and I wanted to commemorate this individual who I had worked with closely as a student of mine at UC Berkeley, and whose future was now in a kind of precarious position. So, Tausif, thank you for starting with this image. I think it kind of sets the tone for how we're going to look at the other ones moving forward.
Right. And if we could just go to the next one. I mean, what you just unpacked for us, Stephanie, all those different layers, like the layers that are embedded onto that very Photoshop ground, um, that was in just one image. But what that process shows to me is that every image actually has these kinds of layers of history, of politics, of political urgency in its own moment, and it exists with other images. So we're so flooded with images and we're so flooded with discourses, especially those of us who are people of color or from marginalized backgrounds or citizenship statuses, whatever the case may be. Not only are we sort of flooded with images, but we're also flooded with discourses about visibility as this sort of net positive, net good, unassailable thing that we should all aspire to. But these images, and this is from the same year, but a slightly different sort of image, these images demonstrate that there's a real danger in being visible. So what are the ethics of making someone visible who's already sort of marginalized by the state, but whose visibility would put them at even greater risk? I think what you have sort of done in these images is demonstrate that there's so many layers of danger and threat, but also promise, and to me, a real sort of unraveling of what it means to be the figure and what it means to be the ground in the image. And it's the idea that as we move through different spaces, sometimes we are the ground, or sometimes really stark against the ground where we become more visible. And these kinds of risks and threats, I think are, in my opinion, mitigated by your sort of refusal, and the refusal of your subjects to show their faces. So in here, we also have a similar cloaked face, but it's in the style of, let's say, like a passport photograph or, an identification photograph.
Yeah, and so, obviously it connects to the previous image, but what I was trying to respond to in this case was how we're regimented in certain ways to present ourselves as necessary or necessitated by, say, applications for visas or citizenship applications. And in this particular series, it was, by ganging them up in a kind of, 6 images to a, one kind of frame. It really reminded me of some of the early passport or application photos that I would have to take, and myself also as an immigrant. So to the United States, having been born in the Philippines and also coming as a quote unquote resident alien, there was always this notion that you could be removed. You had to kind of prove your ability to be a productive person in the United States, and that somehow there were these markers of what that could be. And so in this case, it's very tiny. These are very, very small images, and they're so intimate that they're almost difficult to see when they're, viewed in real life.
Right. And that difficulty to see is your way of making the viewer do a little bit of work, right? I think that that sort of engagement that you have with the viewer, in challenging what it means to see, um, in our contemporary world where we're so, again, flooded with images, inundated even, um, so much comes with such ease. And that ease always has a price. Like you said, the state, I too am an immigrant to the United States, naturalized, even that word naturalized is, is so ridiculous. But through these very bureaucratic official processes by the state, I have been made a citizen. But to become a citizen of this nation requires so much information, so much of your own privacy and agency that you have to give away in order to take some of the quote unquote privileges of this country. And I think what you're doing at the level of image, the 3 3/5 by 4 1/5 image, is really kind of scaling down all of that bureaucracy, all of those politics, all of those embedded layers into something that we have to strain to really engage with. That too is a kind of refusal, on the part of the subject and on the image itself. And it's these gestures of almost, let's say, seduction and refusal, of restraint and giving, that I think makes your work so dynamic. And if we could go to the next slide, our viewers at home might be able to see how dynamic that is. So this is an installation image of Dodge and Burn, which is currently on view at Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco. It's the last week that it's on view. So if you're in the city, please go see the show. And if we could go to the next slide, the show really offers a sampling of the many modes in which you work. So just in this image alone, we're seeing these chroma key green photographs, we're seeing an installation, and we're seeing these other photographs that you've really worked with the archive and making sort of meta commentaries on the practice of photography itself. And if we could go to the next slide, we can sort of hone in on this particular installation, which gives the title of the exhibition as well. And I just want to read out some of the materials because I think it's really important, and then I'll let you sort of dive into sort of the inspiration and construction of this work. But for those at home, wooden platform, digital photos, and printed vinyl on laser cut wood, chroma key fabric, printed backdrop, seamless paper, artificial plants, and mixed media. That all-encompassing mixed media. Um, I think that this work is so brilliant, and its own mode of display as a platform on which so many things are presented to the viewer speaks to the critical way that you're always engaging form and presentation. So how did you come to create this work?
Yeah, no, thanks for that introduction on this. So it's this particular work, it's kind of like the centerpiece of the exhibition. And so just as some background, working with Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco, we decided that it would be a really wonderful time to kind of bring together almost 20 years worth of selected projects, because I do get this wonderful opportunity to exhibit in a lot of museums outside of the Bay Area, but within San Francisco, a lot of these pieces had actually never been seen. So we kind of gathered, and picked. And when we were thinking about, well, what do we kind of, revolve the show around, I really was excited about this particular work because it is so much about photography, and yet it is so physical. It's an installation that appears to be almost like a stage set. So it's a 20-foot by 8-foot platform. And on top of it are everything from prop-like images to, textile backdrops to three-dimensional, what appear to be costumes. And I really see this particular work as a kind of like collapse of both historical references as well as contemporary issues of, kind of political struggle, and also how those of us who find ourselves having to kind of reimagine how we're depicted in opposition to the historical image. On a personal note, again, I am pulling from the history of of America's colonization of the Philippines from 1898 to 1945, and really thinking about how some of the photographs and images that came from, these excursions overseas to the Philippines really still dominate how the Philippines is thought of and represented even, over 100 years later. So what we have here is, everything from Google image searches of colonial images of the Philippines to images of objects that have been downloaded from different museum collections of Filipino artifacts, and then printing them at 100% size and mounting them onto laser cut wood. So it's kind of like, I also see this work as incredibly layered. Like, it has references to color calibration charts from contemporary digital imaging technologies, all the way to, 100-year-old images and processes. And mixed in also is, this vibrant chroma key green. And for me, I've really been thinking about how chroma key green, again, it's, this sort of stand-in color where through digital technology, you drop that out and you replace it with almost, anything that you want it to be. And mixed in here are everything from chroma key green plants to chroma key painted tiki torches and baseball caps that are, kind of reminiscent of a kind of mega-like recent history. So I also think of this work really as like it's almost like you have too many screens open on your computer. When you have a lot of, you're doing research and everything is open all at once. And then you get this kind of cacophony of meaning through those positions.
Right. I mean, this is what I love so much about your work is that it's always so reflexive on its own process, right? So it's thinking about and this particular work, I'll just also add you were doing research into the World's Fair in St. Louis as because this was a commission for that museum. And in doing research for that show and this project, you uncovered even more violence into in relation to the Philippines and the US at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And I think that that specificity of context, but the sort of almost genericness of these, these calibration charts, some of the sort of symbols of, the MAGA sort of moment in 2016, 2017, there's that genericness, but then there's this incredibly deeply researched specificity of these images of the Philippines, of the particular kind of fruits. But then, that genericness comes in again because you're using stock photos with the watermark. Like I think that as an artist who's so deeply embedded within the process of historical research, but then also the process of what it means to create forms, what it means to use already existing images, what it means to take certain things and rearrange them. I just see this sort of sensibility that you're one kind of showing your work, but also demonstrating that this process is both deeply personal and it's a lot of work, right? It's the hand that does the sort of searching in the toolbar, but that drags the cursor, but it's also the hand that sort of arranges the particular elements of the sculpture that adjusts and that places things. That to me also underscores that images are not neutral. There's no such thing as a kind of neutral image, even as we try to find that background, that diamond pattern background against which, some things might be equal. The histories of colonialism and imperialism have made it so that we're not on like a level playing ground. And I think that the way that you've just quite literally arranged different elements and printed them so that they become almost they materialize as signs. Anyone who's kind of sat through an introductory art history class or something has sort of been subjected to this diatribe on semiotics and that kind of difference between symbols and signs. But here what you're doing is really materializing it. You're printing them out, affixing them so that these emojis that we just see on screen actually come as these almost decoys, I would say. There's this sense of enticement, but then you come closer and they're all, these props, as you said, and they're propped up in this way. So what does that say about images? What does that say about their longevity?
Yeah, well, I think one of my challenges has been since I've been working with institutional archives, a lot of the images I look at are, say, produced 100 years ago or, even older. And my challenge has been, how do I create a dialogue that carries those images forward, but in a way also so that people today who are used to, say, digital images or the flow of information through much faster means than the physical photograph in the past, where can I bring back into like a contemporary critical dialogue these historical images, because I think there's also a tendency to, romanticize the idea of artists in archives, that everything kind of looks sort of sepia toned, or, like this kind of nostalgic kind of vision of things. And I was really feeling like these images are, they were the original images of colonial era Philippines were completely stage managed. They were set up in a way to both, profess that the Philippines was in needed its own kind of uplift, through the United States, and also, it was really, I think, constructed images in many cases, especially from, say, ethnographic images. And my challenge has also been, when dealing or looking at harmful images from the past, and by those I mean images in which people were potentially subjected to being photographed under conditions under which they did not agree, or they did not realize why they were being posed, in different ways. I've really attempted to be cautious and careful about representing them so that folks have a kind of perceived agency instead of being just subjugated. So in this case, we're looking at an image of at the time, an upper class Filipino woman. And I chose this image because she's literally looking back at the camera through a reflection of a mirror, kind of like, to me, very conscious of the gaze that's being put on her, but also of the gaze she's giving back to the camera. Whether or not, that was the intention of the original image, who knows? But when I gather together these forms of potential resistance, I really am thinking about, how we can reclaim that which was kind of staged for us in the past.
Right. And I just want to point out how, firstly, how wonderfully you articulated that. And the phrase that you used, the site of potential resistance. Like, I think that is what makes your practice stand out so much, is that you're not being overly, like you said, romantic or too nostalgic or optimistic about what images can and can't do. We can't go back and entirely pretend that these violent histories didn't happen. But what we can go back and do is reclaim those narratives and stories and those subjects who were essentially treated like objects, right? Like under these conditions of violence and colonialism. I think that by identifying these works and these images in the archive as sites of potential, but not necessarily in and of themselves reparation, you really are putting pressure on sort of the image of the artist as this romantic kind of just excavator of history, but rather someone who is taking a critical stance and critical eye toward what images can and can't do, what archives can and can't do. I think the idea of possibility and potential really helps to frame some of the ways that your work operates. And if we could go to the next slide, we will see what I mean in terms of, sorry, next slide after that, about potential and history. So this is also from the exhibition at Catherine Clark, and these are photographs, and I want to point out the photograph at sort of the far left toward the bottom of the wall in particular, because here you're staging quite literally an intervention into the ethnographic photograph, the ethnographic photograph that perhaps might be found in a colonial archive that seeks to put in place, almost pin down who this person might be, but only in terms of sort of empirical observable characteristics, what tribe they belong to, what race, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. These are attempts to almost like pin down someone. And what you've done is through the act of recreation and really sort of breaking down the individual elements of the ethnographic image, you've managed, I think, to really take that sort of static idea of the ethnographic photograph and bring it, animate it quite literally in a way. Could you talk a little bit about that particular intervention?
Sure, yeah. So in the context of this particular sort of salon style hanging, we gathered together multiple images from actually different projects, but tried to have them speak with each other. So in the middle of these like still lives of flowers and the migrants photos that had the kind of passport like collection of images. On the very bottom or the kind of lower left, you can kind of see what looks like this black and white, very graphic, pseudo-ethnographic image. And it's actually one of the earliest photo series that I had been working on. I think I started in 2013, and I was reconstructing using just common mass-produced clothes that I was buying at shopping malls with very kind of graphic black and white patterns. I was constructing these very simple, informal, and actually quite satirical versions of ethnographic images that I had been seeing taken from the Philippines. But in the images, you can kind of see that the backdrops are made out of paper and that, there's like accessories kind of lying around and that I'm even holding the cord that attaches to the camera. So these were, it's fascinating because those images, they were in a series of works and they actually got a lot of traction because I think they were quite legible in the sense that, people would ask me like, they would frame them as somehow portraits, like, oh, these are portraits, or even self-portraits. And I was like, no, these are very performative examples of a kind of fiction,
Right.
So I
Right.
think that's especially with artists of color, if you interject anything that has either your body in it or another body of color, there's sometimes this assumption by the audience that there must be a kind of ethnic truth to it or authority. And in that particular body of work, I really wanted to push against that and
Right.
play with a total construction.
Exactly. You're taking it to, at every level, I think, in this installation, the elemental, right? So here are the elements of an image. It's the pose, it's the sort of camera that you can hold in your hand, it's the backdrop, it's the color grading charts. All of these work together simultaneously, perhaps at different levels, to present what we see before us. And I think that once and a viewer can sort of really parse that you're taking it to this, dissecting it to this elemental level, they can also perhaps take that extension to understand that part of what colonialism's aim was to dissect people and entire communities and ways of life and and communities for that kind of consumption, for that imperial consumption. If we sort of trace the line between our present day digital cameras and phones to the invention of photography simultaneously in various parts of Europe and Brazil, it wasn't it wasn't too long after that that the camera made its way to the colony. There was a reason for that. It was because it was a way of, quote unquote, getting the objective aspects of a culture. And I think that in deconstructing that, you're showing that, there is no such thing as this objective lens that you can put on a culture that is so rich and multifaceted and complex. Um, and that's why I think the image amongst all these other images in the salon style hang has such power. Um, if we could go on to the next slide, I think we might be able to further go into fictiveness and arrangement and display. So this installation is on view as well at Catherine Clark right now, and it's called Raiders from 2011. And what I love about this image so much is its very seductiveness. So when I entered the gallery, I saw it across the room, and I was just sort of struck both by in terms of how it's presented in its lighting and its arrangement of these beautifully colored objects, these vases. And then if we can go to the next image. It's the decoy again. It's the sort of seduction and betrayal of the image, and especially in this setting, which is mimicking imperial colonial loot, these massive displays that people would just show of here's what we got from the colonies, and sort of bringing it to the level of just the printed image on plywood. It really, I think, it just fucks with your brain in the best way. I think it's brilliant. Could you talk about how you got to thinking about these kinds of display? It's such a treat and also a disappointment, but in a good way for the
Yeah,
viewer.
yeah. No, I think between Dodge and Burn, right, which was literally made, I guess, 5 years ago, and then this earlier work, which was made now, what, 13 years ago. The thinking through the kind of prop-like aspect, right, the sort of stage managing of how cultures or collections even are displayed. Raiders, and I love this word, this title, because it reminds me of everything from like Raiders of the Lost Ark, which was a kind of play also of this kind of swashbuckling anthropologist who, or sorry, archaeologist who, gets precious artifacts from around the world. All the way to then thinking about, well, what does that mean for a museum in the sense when, collections now are being kind of scrutinized in terms of, provenance of how objects have been accumulated, or, what channels did they go through in order to get to, the final repository of the museum. Raiders, this particular work actually is very site specific. It pulls specifically from the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And I was also thinking about, my own connection to this museum that I was somehow, meant to be culturally a part of. And yet, growing up in San Francisco, and visiting the museum, it was a fairly traditional space of mostly accumulated objects, like pretty objects, decorator objects, religious objects. And I was really thinking about how myself as an Asian American child growing up in the Bay Area, I found it very difficult to kind of connect to this collection because it didn't seem to reflect my lived experience. It reflected the idea of Asia as constructed by the collectors who had accumulated the work and then given it to the museum. And so it was my kind of nod, to okay, if how am I going to reclaim, I guess, the space of that museum? And I did that by, in a way, raiding their own collection. So I went online to their museum website and I downloaded as many images of their vases as I could find. And then I blew them up to the actual size of the object and then created my own collection of them. So I turned it back into contemporary art after, not having been able to connect on it in this kind of antiquarian way. There's also something highly problematic about this in the sense that, I'm also compressing multiple cultural artifacts into one giant Orientalist lump.
Mhm.
Like
Right.
literally you can tell these very beautiful and very specific cultural forms, like for anyone who's, familiar with, this ceramic work, it's, it's a very specific kind of culture and time period. And yet my display, kind of just makes a pretty collection.
Right.
And so in a way, I'm not doing it any better. I'm just kind of amplifying its I guess staged, presence.
But I think that to a certain degree, that amplification is so necessary because we take for granted how much of this colonial history informs who we are, how we understand ourselves. I mean, even as you were saying, um, growing up in San Francisco, an incredibly multicultural city, and not feeling that your lived experience is being reflected. Part of that is because we live in a sort of universe in which, and in our particular sort of American United States setting, wherein so much of what it means to be represented is to be represented in a very limited, particular way. So the sort of Chinese vase, quote unquote, it might not actually be Chinese, but the Chinese porcelain vase becomes this sort of stand-in for Chinese culture writ large because it's recognizable, because it's repeated. And I think that in showing how almost flimsy these kinds of images can be, you're really putting weight on what it means to desire certain forms of representation, and what would it actually mean to represent a person and their culture with the kind of depth and nuance that's required of them. Is that something that's possible within the space of um, these sort of massive collections from the 19th century? I think what you're doing too is by almost transferring these precious objects into these and transposing them into these more sort of flimsy or almost makeshift provisional um, materials, you're suggesting something about the actual construction of history. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll clarify what I mean by that. Um, One thing, something that I think your work does so well is you don't spare anyone. You're showing works at a museum, you're going through a museum's archives, but you're also showing, how messed up these archives can be or collections can be. And you're showing your intervention, you're showing all the sorts of different hands and forms of labor that are involved in creating display. So can we talk a little bit about what we're seeing here in terms of these two specific works? So the four photographs on the wall and the curtain, both of which are real interventions in the mythography of the American West.
Yes, yeah. No, thanks for bringing this forward too, because in recent years, I've really become fascinated with 19th century American landscape painting and sculpture. And I think it's because, in thinking how, say, colonial photographs were constructions, Other, images and objects that were being created around the same time in the United States in particular were also, a kind of stage managing or construction. And so this particular work that we're looking at is actually an excerpt of a much larger site-specific installation that was at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth, Texas. And I'd been commissioned by a curator there, Kristen Gaylord, to respond somehow to their collection. And so the Amon Carter was founded on mostly paintings and sculptures like Frederick Remington, and they had some Bierstadts, but a lot of the work there had this very kind of romantic look at the American West, mostly through the lens too of the kind of typical cowboys and Indians framing. And given that, it's also a contemporary art space and they have, a much broader collection than just that, the original collection is still a kind of foundation, so when people go there, they want to see images of the cowboys. They want to see this kind of like, very iconic view. And so thankfully, though, the museum was open to me going in and reworking some of the objects. So what you're looking at on the right-hand side are a series of 4 photographs from a series called Setups, where I'd taken the kind of iconic Remington Bronco Buster and a couple other objects. There we go. In this case, The Outlaw was its original title. And I worked with the preparators and also the curator to rephotograph them in such a way as to position them moving away from the camera or moving away from, the lens. Like you see the backs of them, they kind of have lost their kind of heroic luster. We left on the little tag labels that also come when, they're put in, when they're kept safely in storage. And then in this case, I worked with one of the preparators to intervene with, by holding it with their hands in their gloves as if, they were placing it somewhere. And so for me, this series was really about, I guess, sizing them down, taking them down from this kind of heroic space. And the backdrop also is this like black satin that kind of echoes the patina of metal of the sculpture. So you kind of have a hard time, seeing its outline. Like it's very reflective. It's got a lot going on here. And so these images were originally produced at 6 feet tall in the main entryway of the Amon Carter, and you had to walk by them in order to get to the rest of the collection. And we also had these gorgeous vinyl backdrops that were kind of simulated or similar to the textile digital panels in the Catherine Clark installation. So here on the right-hand side is actually the hands of the curator I worked with. I had her pose with the actual measuring tape. And, this interjection of hands, which does come up in a lot of my work recently, is to kind of like frame the space as a lived and physical space in which we are literally, making it, like making the images or, moving things around to get the shot that we need. It's not a neutral space.
It's not a neutral space. And I just have to say, love hearing you talk about this series because, again, you're examining history, you're examining the mythography of the American West, the heroism, the sort of romanticized figure of the cowboy that, again, if you repeat an image, if you perform it enough, it becomes embedded into a kind of cultural memory and cultural history. But you're doing it, your examination is so sensuous. It's so much about the level of, as you said, the shine and luster of the surface, the different materials and textures that come up. And I think by decentering vision as the primary mode of sort of experience and knowledge, you're also undermining that very sort of colonial framing and historical mode that has allowed this kind of vision, right? So in demonstrating hands, gloved hands, need to preserve the archives. In the archives, you're also signaling to us as viewers, there are other ways of knowing these histories, right? There are ways of knowing that are embodied. There are ways of knowing that are not solely about vision, but it's also how memory can be transferred or understood through different modes of touch, that's not something you get to do at an art gallery or a museum as a viewer. So I think by at least sharing with us and sort of centering that process of touch, of labor, of what it means to actually feel history. What would that be like? And the other element of the hands is the sort of the way that they signal kind of manipulation um of how you can actually put different things side by side and have a completely new narrative. You could rearrange, or you could actually find the very seams at which someone placed things together, and then perhaps understand how the narrative came to be. And this work right here, fixed focus, is a perfect example of how to do that, because you in this work are taking the archival files of Dean Conant Worcester, let's say,
Yeah.
I think his pronouns, and who was an American ethnographer and imperialist in the Philippines. And in the center of each of these images, you've zoomed in on the correction within the archive. So it could be like a circling, something mistyped, a factual error, whatever the case may be. These are where you have these slippages in the archives that are supposed to be this sort of repository of empirical imperial knowledge. But we understand through these sort of zoom ins on the mistakes that these are fallible. These were made by humans who also had incredibly racist biases, and their word is not the final word. And I think that in showing these textures and slippages and sort of almost gaps too in the archive of where we might not find the not what we're looking for. You have done such a great job in demonstrating that history is alive. The archives are literally sort of vibrating with so much life. They're not this sort of static end all be all last word. We can read the archives differently. We can intervene and sort of rearrange history to serve the kinds of justice that we did not see under colonialism.
Yeah, well, I think one of the problems of working in archives is that, well, one, many of them, okay, I guess I should back up. So in 2019, I applied for and received a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship to specifically work with the Archive Center in Washington, D.C. within the National Museum of American History. So I decided that I wanted to look at how the main, kind of archive of the United States saw itself, and also how it saw Filipinos and Filipino Americans. And I wasn't interested in doing this to kind of, find like a romantic cultural connection to my identity or my past. It was more about how does the empire, the United States, see its colony, and what traces of it are in its own archive. And going through the search, what I found were a lot of documents, a lot of photographs, also a lot of like weird like gaps and holes, and a lot of, I would say, like incomplete visions. And that's literally because, the curatorial focus or whatever had come into the archive was mostly through the lens of, say, like military or administrative or ethnographic. And those are definitely from a very specific standpoint. So when you see all these documents, the question is like, oh my goodness, how are you going to translate this into an artwork?
Yeah.
Like literally, like what do you do with all this stuff? And, for this particular work, as you mentioned, I decided when I was looking at these typed manuscripts and also these crappy Xeroxes of the typed manuscripts. So in a lot of cases, when I'm shooting in the archive, I'm actually under a lot of pressure to get the images that I need quickly because your time there is usually, finite. You are attempting to go through like hundreds or even thousands of images or documents, and you might not even know yet what you want to do with it. So in my process, I just shoot as many things as possible. And sometimes with an inkling of what I want to do with it. In other cases, it's unclear. And then later, as I'm sorting through the images, I try to create or edit together, the concepts. Or in some cases, like the previous image that was up where I had my hand, in a glove holding one photo over the other, I'm literally attempting to kind of collage together meaning directly in the archive. So for this one, it was the errors in the document. Like there's a lot of text right at the center of each of these 8.5 by 11 panels that have been X'd out by a typewriter. So someone had gone in and kind of made corrections to Dean Worcester's ethnographic recounting of the Philippines. And so by focusing on the kind of corrections that he was subjected to, I really wanted to also point out that the authority that we give the archive or what it holds is actually kind of up for grabs because, granted, yes, there are, there's many historical, events that have been cataloged or, kind of captured in there that actually did happen. But how then we process that, that history or that reality through language or the lens of the archive can sometimes come to overshadow and give the captioning only like one dimension.
And I think that's a brilliant sort of underscoring of an approach to archives that doesn't have to be fetishistic, right? It doesn't have to be that the archive is both the end all be all of authority, but it also doesn't have to be that the archive is something that the artist sort of gains some kind of credibility for going into, like so first the idea that Claire Bishop has sort of criticized research-based practices as too much information overload. I think that what you highlight in something like in all of your works, but especially this work, to me at least, what can an artist do that an archivist as a researcher, an underpaid grad student, can't do in the archives? I think they're, by asking different questions about what it means to look for something, about what constitutes information, I often find myself in, basements or in deep rabbit holes on the internet looking for a very, very specific thing where it's like, if I just have this thing, I will unlock my paper and I will stop procrastinating and figure it out. But one, that never really works. That's just procrastination. But two, I think that in sort of thinking about, well, what are some of the patterns here? What are some of the ideas that actually can be conveyed visually? And what sorts of information are possible that to be unlocked or to be experienced or to be gained that isn't just about factual evidence per se. This isn't really evidence of anything we don't already know, which is that people make mistakes. It's more of the fact that the archive is something that has a form, that has forms that can slip past each other, can have mistakes, and that the archive is very material in itself. I think that sort of just the different forms of annotation themselves are quite interesting on what they say about the nature of imperial authority. If we could go to the next slide, I'm keeping track of time here. Again, that imperial authority is written, right? It's literally written down. And in this portion of the installation, you've also zoomed in and painted and zoomed in on the painted hands that hold guns, that hold different things in Western paintings from America. And I think that it's that sensibility you have to really zoom in and to also scale back to sort of find different vantage points with which we might uncover something new. That is a very artistic thing. I look with my neck craned down at archives, but you're looking in so many different ways, and in doing so, encouraging us to look for details we might not have noticed as well.
Yeah. Well, in this particular, so we're looking at a detail of, the Amon Carter installation. It was a large 50-foot long, kind of like throughway gallery space by 15 feet high. And on one side, it had the earlier setup photos with the iconic Frederick Remington Bronco Buster statue. And then on the opposite side of that were blown up photographs that I'd taken of the actual paintings that were in the Carter's galleries, but I focused on the hands of men, because in many of these images of 19th century American landscapes or gatherings of people, the men there was a lot of like holding of guns, of pointing, of legislating, of surveying. There was this kind of very, I guess, pointed depiction of what their hands were doing symbolically to the landscape, to the creation of, or the furthering of manifest destiny as a kind of overarching philosophy, as well as to how the paintings showed men as being this primary force of conquest. So by just excerpting the hands, though, and isolating them from the larger narrative, it was my way of, again, not necessarily representing these overarching images, because we kind of already know what they do or what they look like. But how are these hands across multiple paintings telling a larger story of what the United States values or highlights as its formation? And so what I appreciated about this is that the Carter, I think, had a really wonderful, they were open to having this produced by it. And it also kind of then framed visitors to be able to look at the actual paintings in real life and then reconsider, well, what's another lens to look at this as opposed to a kind of historical fact? Because I think when people go into museums and galleries with quote unquote old paintings, they're actually looking they see it as a kind of historical narrative and historical fact, as opposed to a construction at the time of what either the patron or the painter or culture at large wanted to see.
Right. And there's something about the hands in particular, both in what they're doing in the very action, but also the hand as indexing the possibility of manipulation, the possibility of creation. That construction is, done through the very same fingers and the hands that have held these guns and held these archives, all these sorts of things. That sort of attention, I think, is so important to your practice, because it's as if you're demonstrating what could, here's what we know and here's what happened to the extent that we know, it from the historical photographic record. but here's how it might have been different, how it could still be different. There's that, again, potential there. And someone in the chat had mentioned the excellent book by Ariella Azoulay of, unlearning imperialism. And so I want to, bring us back to the Guggenheim exhibition where you've displayed these two just incredible photographs called Block Out the Sun Shadow and Block Out the Sun Shield. I think that here, so much of what we've talked about today about potential histories, about what it means to work through the archive, about the labor of the artist, about what it means to do research and embody it and feel it. So much coalesces in these particular images. And I wonder if you might just tell us a little bit about them, and then we can talk about the book and answer any questions.
Yeah. So briefly, this series of works relates to the earlier excavations of the different archives that were covering the St. Louis World's Fair from 1904. And just as some quick background on it, it was a fair in which 1,200 Filipinos were imported into the United States to then be put on display for the fairgoers, and they were kind of made to perform these rituals or semblances of their culture for an American audience. And so after looking at hundreds of these photographs, in many cases these images actually came to also really be seen as definitive of how Filipinos actually lived or worked. I really wanted to intervene very physically with them. So as I was going through the photos on site, literally in the archives, I wanted to protect the people being depicted, to just kind of deny the right that people felt they had to look at or photograph them and present them, for decades later, somehow frozen in this space. And so by using my own hands in the archive, it became for me this a space of touching, literally kind of like shielding them, from the viewer with my hands, but also touching the photographs. That there was this kind of connection 100 years later. And I see it as actually a gentle intervention. So unlike how, say, hands in the manhandled, cowboy paintings were seen as these like, aggressive or manipulating kind of activities, this one to me felt reparative in a certain way, because it was, releasing these people from having to, be collected or displayed again, over 100 years later. And I think that's always the dilemma for me, is that, yes, we find these very problematic images or documents in archives, but instead of just reproducing it with, say, outrage, and how can we talk back to it and do so that gives people back their humanity? So, one way of looking at these works is also that, oh, I'm, erasing them or removing them. And I would actually counter that and say, actually, no, you can still see the evidence of them being there, but I'm attempting to kind of like grant them by making them not invisible, but not,
Up for
collective.
consumption. Yeah,
Yeah,
up for like a
right.
kind of consumption. And that notion of a shared humanity, you're reaching back into this past, a past that you're connected to, and reaching back and trying to touch that history. There's something that is quite, I think, a sort of humility in that, right? You are also a person trying to exist and learn and sort of deal with this everyday sort of violences that we live under today. In recognizing their shared humanity and that's not something that's a given, even as we do our quote unquote cool, objective, detached forms of looking as viewers of art, um, we do sort of relegate some of these people to the past, but in fact, no one really lives, in the present. We all live within, 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the present, maybe our heads in the future or something like that. And I think that the experience of going through your monograph and touching it and really sort of understanding the different forms of like weights and textures of paper and flipping through the covers and understanding how you've really carefully thought about how to present this information, in a way that is multisensory and multi-layered, that doesn't just represent images that have a history of violence. I think the attention you gave to the textures of this book, how it's presented, how the experience of opening it and reading it, from everything from like the sort of desktop cinema-esque or collages to the act of having to, sort of push the covers back to read the slips inside. It's a really active and engaging book, and it's a really active and engaging way to understand history. There's no such thing, I think, as a passive participant in this book, and that's so much by your design, and I just have to sort of commend you for that real attention to form, to make the viewer do some work to get this information.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I also have to share, though, that Radius Books, their designer, David Chicky, did the most amazing job just designing all the things you talked about with, it's set up so that it's almost like you're looking through folders and you're
Yes.
sifting and the pages are oddly sized. And it really does, I worked with him closely to try to simulate what it's like to physically sift through things in the archive. So hopefully that comes through. I'm also just really glad that, so this is my first monograph ever. And I think, it's just so beautifully designed, and it kind of creates this bookend in the sense that, all the time that I've been spent in these institutional archives, there's this attempt here in this book to really, kind of like give that research process the space. So thank you. I'm so happy for it, and yay.
And I think maybe we can go into questions, and then we will conclude with a little bit of a reading from Stephanie.
Yes, thank you so much, Tausif. Thank you so much, Stephanie. This has been so amazing and so incredible to hear about, and huge congratulations on this show. We do have a couple questions here from the audience, and our first question is from Kimberly. And Kimberly, I will allow you to unmute.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, Kimberly.
Like long-time listener, like first-time caller. Thank you for this talk. I have some comments, and then I do have a question, and it's also in the chat, and I'm going to try to get through it. But I've been thinking a lot about how your art practice like moves beyond the boundaries of the art world, while also flourishing within the boundaries. And I'm specifically thinking about the documentation that you share on social media, Instagram, of your experience in the archives, like particularly the Lopez Museum recently. And that generous documentation like allows access to many of us who can't get into those archives in this beautiful way, because you actually collage. It itself is, I feel, like an art practice. So in sharing these process notes, I feel like it's an extended technique. Like it's a conceptualist performance almost. It's like practice of, it continues your practice of intervening in the art marketplace, which you've kind of done a lot before. And I also think it's a kind of a worlding, because it's like you're bringing together the Lopez Museum and then also the Filipino American National Historical Society, who's a beneficiary of your blind spots artifacts. And I did get or photograph. So I had like a series of questions. If you could speak to your counter archival practices, maybe even outside of the gallery, that could be your radius monograph, which I also love, the Rogue Finding Aid project, blind spots artifacts, which you're, allowing to circulate, how they allow us to sort of like interact with the archive outside of sort of the art spaces of the galleries. And if this practice kind of has given you some particular insight, which could be a critique of like the archival economy, and how, I mean, it's definitely democratizing, but I think I'm fascinated by the decisions that you make all along the way to do all of these projects. And I just also wanted to celebrate that. So thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. That's really generous of you to frame it that way. And I think, what you're referencing are a number of projects that you're right. I concurrently do along with the presentable gallery or museum work. So, as an artist and an educator, there's, we have to, or sorry, I, as an artist, I have to produce things that get shown. There's this very sort of like physical demand for that. And so, I create installations, I create sculptures, etc. Along the way, I also feel like I have both a pedagogical practice as well as a kind of activist practice when it comes to thinking how to share some of the research and knowledge that I've gained by entering into these quite rarefied spaces. So I'm lucky enough that I think under the guise of my Berkeley professorship, I get access, like I literally can say, oh, I'm a researcher, and I can go into these spaces. It takes a lot of time, effort, and money, I think, to access archives physically. Like in many cases, these are physical spaces that you have to travel your body to. You have to, spend money to, get yourself over there. And then all of a sudden look at things that have never been digitized, but completely pertain to our shared history. And so I have a number of projects that are more pedagogical in nature. Like they're mostly on my website actually. So if you go there, you can click through, find projects called like the Rogue Finding Aid, where I'm literally sharing with researchers thousands of images I've taken within archived spaces that have not been digitized before. And these are done in a kind of like informal and I hope generous way. People can contact me for the links, and I'll show you. I can share mostly from looking at images of Filipinos, Filipino Americans, and the Philippines. But then I guess you also mentioned, and we can also kind of close out with that, most recently I've been working not with colonial archives, but with archives made by Filipinos or Filipino Americans for themselves. And so that's a totally different politics, a totally different focus. The Filipino American National Historical Society in Seattle, which I'm currently working on a project, and you can kind of see some of the fruits behind me. That's a living archive that is still being stewarded and run by its 92-year-old founder, Dorothy Cordova, and then also the Lopez Museum's ownership of the Manila Chronicle archives in the Philippines, and that's from the 1960s and 70s. So again, different from the colonial archive, but thank you for raising all that.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, and thanks, Stephanie, for answering those questions. Our next and final question in our Q&A today is from GE. GE, you can go ahead and unmute.
Thank you very, very, very much. Could you talk a bit about your concept of unruly materials and how they figure into your efforts overall? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks. So I love that word, unruly, right? I mean, it's an odd word. It kind of doesn't roll off the tongue easily, actually. But when I think of unruly, it was really from my own experience of when I first started going into physical archives, I was actually kind of surprised at sometimes how disorganized they can be. Or if there is an order to it, sometimes it's a kind of, it literally can be based on just, you know, who donated to that collection or what it is. Like it sometimes it's also disintegrating. Like, you know, it's not the fault of, say, the archivists or the conservators. It's just that material property has a tendency to want to fail. And so the unruliness for me meant that the authority invested in the kind of constant historical narrative brought forward by archives is always kind of like rough, you know, and materially and also meaning wise. But also I wanted to talk about how myself, my own body within the archive, can be an unruly subject. So I'm doing things in there that I'm not necessarily supposed to be doing. I'm layering photos in a way that, you know, was never meant to be with each other. I'm respectfully touching things, but I'm touching things. You know, I'm unruly, the archive is unruly, and the possibility for poetics can happen if we like let go of, you know, being constrained by its authority. Thank you for that
very
question.
much. Oh no, I love it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, GE. And thank you, Stephanie. That was an amazing answer. And now to conclude, I'll pass it back over to you for a reading.
Okay, so I was invited, the Brooklyn Rail invited me to give just a short 5-minute reading from the book, The Unruly Archive. Rather than hash my introduction or even text, you know, about me, I really want to highlight that I invited 9 other artists to contribute short essays about their own work in archives. And that was because, again, I wanted a dialogue. I wanted to not just focus on my own work, but how are other artists kind of, you know, presenting themselves in these unruly spaces. So I'm just going to read a very short essay called How Do You Talk Back to the Archive? And it was my prompt to the 9 writers. And it also gives a little overview of their work. So this is literally the invitation I sent them as to how to write for this book. How do you talk back to the archive? By talk back, I mean, how are you interrogating, borrowing from, manipulating, departing from, utilizing, changing, resuscitating, reorganizing, reinterpreting, and perhaps even speaking out or against it? What motivates you to do this work? What methods do you use? What does it feel like to work in archives? What are the unexpected pleasures or traumas that can arise from this process? What project or projects do you want to share? What archives have you mined and why? What is at stake for you? This was the proposition I sent to 9 working artists whose unruly practices I respect and admire. I've followed their research-based work for years, and their responses evidence deeply thoughtful practices that complicate, counter, and engage the question of working within archives. Carmen Wynant shares the anxious pleasures and political problematics of feminist archive excavations, while Astria Suparak argues for how historical material can speak to a more equitable vision of a future. Gelare Koshkazaran describes a tactic of refusing the archive's power in order to push beyond it, and Jason Lazarus presents a textual poetics that lyrically reflects the process of sifting and searching. Savannah Wood shares the history of an African-American newspaper birthed from familial lineage and shows how an archive made by a community for the community creates a powerful legacy. Wendy Redstar breathes story and life into native objects and artifacts held in institutional collections, repairing connective tissues once formerly closed off. And L.J. Roberts pulls ghosts from the margins of microfilm, finding queer trans kinship and fierce beauty. Finally, Mine Atairu trains AI generative algorithms onto Benin bronzes and the colonial archive to create visions of possibility, while Pio Abad exhumes a dictator's legacy to actively fight ongoing political erasure and amnesia in the Philippines. Their profound contributions to this book link a wide variety of practices in and out of archives, all under an umbrella of a sense of urgency and investment. And for that, I am deeply grateful. Forwards through the archive, not backwards. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Stephanie. Thank you so much. What a perfect way to conclude today's conversation. Huge thanks to you, Stephanie, and to you, Tausif. This has been a really wonderful dialogue and a really great way to start the week. I'd also like to thank the team at Catherine Clark Gallery for helping us to prepare for our event today. And as always, we'd like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the NSE and for supporting our archive, which you can explore on the Rails YouTube channel, and this conversation will be posted there shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 23 years, and I hope you will consider a donation to the Rail, which will support our writers, production, staff, and operations, and there's a link to support us in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Julia Bland and Gabby Collins Fernandez on the occasion of Rivers on the Inside, on view right now at Derek Eller Gallery in New York. Thanks so much to you all for tuning in today, and you can turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much,
you,
everyone
thank
at the
you.
Rail. Thank you,
Thank
Stephanie.
you.
Bye.
Congratulations,
Oh my
Stephanie.
God.
Thank you.
Look
so
at all
much,
these
everyone.
people. I love you guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Love
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
I love
much.
it.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Brilliant conversation.
Amazing conversation. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Bye, everyone. Thank
Stephanie.
you.
Go see the
Go see the
show. Go
show.